We built a global communication network capable of instantaneous connection, assuming this frictionless data would naturally elevate human satisfaction. This chart plots objective material well-being over time. The upward trend confirms physical living standards have consistently increased. But adding subjective satisfaction to the same graph reveals a different story. The subjective trend line collapses, moving in the opposite direction. This collapse occurs even when physical circumstances are stable. People are experiencing an acute sense of failure while standing inside functional, comfortable environments. This deficit is not a collective psychological weakness. It is a structural output of the communication architecture we now inhabit. The internet changed more than just how we speak. It engineered subjective inadequacy by turning personal lifestyle into a competitive arena. Sociologists use reference group theory to explain how we evaluate our social status. The principle suggests that individuals do not measure success against an absolute metric, but by comparing themselves to the surrounding nodes in their immediate network. The digital internet removed the geographic boundaries that historically contained those reference groups. What was once a private, localized experience of daily living became a publicly broadcasted, globally visible performance. To understand modern consumer spending, we must first map this shift in network topology. We can trace a pipeline starting from the architecture of the digital network, moving to the psychological creation of inadequacy, and ending with the behavioral output of emotional spending. Modern consumption operates as an emotional defense mechanism against unbounded global comparison. For most of human history, status evaluation was bounded by physical proximity. You measured yourself against the immediate terrain around you. This represents the historical baseline. A central individual connects to a closed cluster of 10 to 15 surrounding nodes, neighbors, friends, coworkers. Because geography contained this group, lifestyle variations were statistically narrow. You evaluated yourself against a localized, average dataset. The psychological output of this bounded network was stability. Grounded in a localized reality, subjective satisfaction was achievable and easily maintained. In a bounded system, normal feels sufficient because the comparison points reflect an achievable median reality. Algorithmic infinite scrolling replaced that model with an unbounded network, where geographic proximity is irrelevant. This new environment means the physical limitations of the local cluster no longer exist. The result is a mathematical shock. Instead of comparing to 15 local peers, the individual connects to millions of global data points. As the network expands, the central node shrinks. This alters the calculation of where they rank in the social hierarchy. Repetitive daily exposure to this massive network recalibrates the brain's internal expectation of what constitutes a normal life. This stream of high-status data points runs continuously, updating the competitive baseline every single day. This structural shift removes the local, achievable standard of success that human psychology was built to navigate. This global node influx is overwhelming in volume, and it is also fundamentally deceptive. Curation distortion occurs because algorithmic feeds actively suppress mundane daily life, amplifying only heavily filtered, mathematically perfect peak experiences. The network prioritizes specific performance parameters, luxury vacations, flawless apartments, and designer clothing. The human brain misinterprets these rare, top-tier anomalies as the new median standard for daily living. Users generating these data points are engaging in lifestyle as a theatrical performance, stripping away negative or mundane reality before broadcasting. By comparing their unedited, backstage reality to the curated highlight reels of millions, the user is participating in an unwinnable psychological competition. Curation distortion triggers a psychological mechanism known as baseline upgrading. When a person is continuously exposed to an artificially upgraded global lifestyle, their perception of their own life mathematically shrinks. This shrinkage creates a persistent psychological deficit, causing feelings of inadequacy despite a stable material reality. This deficit is manufactured. It is a phantom gap created by the artificial elevation of the digital environment. This psychological deficit triggers a behavioral response known as compensatory consumption. Because the brain treats social status as a survival metric, users utilize high-status goods to repair the perceived damage to their social identity. Signaling theory describes how financial purchases separate from functional usefulness, transforming into symbolic markers used to broadcast social value. This chart maps the divergence. As functional utility drops, social signaling arcs upward. Items like designer apparel or luxury dining map at the peak of the social signaling curve. They offer negligible functional upgrades, but their symbolic value is massive. Digital identity becomes a composite of these status goods, purchased to broadcast value back into the unbounded network. When lifestyle becomes identity, spending morphs into a defensive weapon used to feel competitive in an artificial arena. This dynamic operates as an infinite game. Because the rules are always shifting, status purchasing cannot result in permanent satisfaction. This systemic trap begins with curated exposure. That exposure generates step 2, the artificial deficit. This deficit triggers step 3, the status purchase. Finally, the purchase is broadcast as digital curation, resetting the baseline and locking the cycle in a continuous loop. Because the global baseline is always upgrading, the psychological deficit is structural. There is no purchase large enough to outpace an infinite network. Major brands execute corporate capture by mapping their products to this exact psychological loop. Corporate entities observe the unbounded network and market their goods as the necessary capital required to maintain a competitive digital identity. The defense against this capture is a rigid logical checklist. The consumer must isolate emotional inadequacy from financial execution. Prior to any significant transaction, you must evaluate an item's raw functional utility separately from its social signaling value. True economic autonomy in the digital age, recognizing that competitive lifestyle curation is an engineered, unwinnable trap,